My wife wanted me to accept opening our relationship. It seemed simple at first glance, an unexpected proposal, but one that could be overcome with a good conversation. After all, we had been together for years, building a life, overcoming challenges that many couples cannot. I loved her, I always believed she loved me too. But that suggestion, coming from his lips, carried a different weight. It wasn't just a bold idea or a passing desire. There was something deeper, something hidden between the lines of what she said and, especially, what she didn't say. The forced smile, the eyes that avoided mine, the touch that no longer carried the same tenderness as before. Everything was there, but I refused to see the obvious. I said no. I categorically refused. For me, love was commitment, exclusivity. But upon seeing the expression on her face, something I had never seen before, a chill ran down my spine. It was a mixture of relief and despair. As if, in that instant, my negative response had released something she had been holding onto for a long time. She didn't protest, she didn't argue, she didn't insist. He just shut up, turned around, and started packing his bags. It wasn't a temporary separation or a pause to reflect, I knew that. It was the end. But it didn't make sense, there were no constant fights, no apparent reason. Why, then, was she willing to abandon everything like that, so suddenly? I didn't realize it at the time, but that suggestion was a disguised farewell, a coldly calculated plan. She was already ready to leave me, and that absurd request was just the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. It was a test, a wicked game to prepare me for the inevitable. And I, naive, didn't see the clues, I didn't connect the dots. All I was left with was emptiness, the weight of the silent betrayal that she had orchestrated so well. But what torments me to this day is the doubt that I have never been able to clarify, what made her give up on us. What was behind that request to open the relationship? What did she hide from me all those years? The truth was there, hidden beneath layers of lies and secrets that had yet to come to light. The answer, which I never knew, is waiting to be revealed. And now, I'm about to find out. The couple lived in a quiet Chicago neighborhood, surrounded by tree-lined streets and Victorian homes, each with its own old charm and stories. To anyone on the outside, Jonathan and Emily's life seemed perfect. Together for more than a decade, they built a life that many envied. Jonathan, a renowned architect, spent his days creating structures that combined elegance and functionality. He had a keen eye for detail, something that was also reflected in his personal life. Emily, on the other hand, was a talented writer, known for her columns in a local magazine, where she discussed relationships, culture, and the complexity of urban life. She had a natural charisma, a charming presence that captured the attention of everyone around her. They met in college, when they were both young and full of dreams. Jonathan was immediately attracted to Emily, not just for her beauty, but for her intelligence and humor. She was a force of nature, someone who challenged his perspectives and made him laugh like no one else. Emily, in turn, was enchanted by the calm and security that Jonathan exuded. He seemed like a safe haven amidst the storms of life, someone she could trust blindly. In the first years of their marriage, their life was a constant adventure. They traveled frequently, tried new hobbies together, and seemed insatiable in their pursuit of new experiences. They were that couple that everyone admired and that many considered the perfect example of partnership and complicity. But like any long-term relationship, things started to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, small cracks began to appear in the seemingly solid foundation they had built. Jonathan, over the years, found himself increasingly immersed in work. His projects became more ambitious, requiring nights and weekends of dedication. He justified his absences with the idea that he was working to ensure a comfortable future for both of them. And, in a way, it was. However, in doing so, he began to lose sight of what really mattered, time and connection with Emily. For her, Jonathan's absence created a void she didn't know how to fill. She was also dedicated to her work, but the nature of her profession allowed her to have more free time, more moments alone to reflect on the life she led. Chicago, with its fast pace and constant demands, became a city of contrasts for Emily. While the days were full of social meetings and professional commitments, the nights were marked by increasing loneliness. Jonathan always arrived late, exhausted and not in the mood for deep conversations. In recent months, discussions about trivial issues began to increase, but they were superficial discussions, without really touching on what was wrong. What used to be resolved with a simple apology now left a resentment that only grew. The silence between them was a sign of something bigger, something they both avoided facing. Friends noticed the change, but no one dared comment. There was a tension in the air whenever they were together, an electricity that wasn't positive. Instead of the affectionate, lively couple from before, they now seemed like two strangers sharing the same space, playing roles that no longer fit. Emily, always introspective, began to question what she wanted for the future. She wondered if she still loved Jonathan the same way, or if she was just stuck in an idealized version of what they once were. To Jonathan, the changes in Emily were palpable, but he refused to admit it. The possibility that something was really wrong in his marriage was a thought he preferred to avoid. Instead, he immersed himself even more in his work, under the illusion that professional success could compensate for personal failure. It was easier to ignore the signs than face them. One night, after another long day at work, Jonathan came home to find Emily sitting on the porch, a glass of wine in her hand, looking at the horizon. The scene, for some reason, made him stop for a moment. She seemed distant, lost in thoughts he couldn't reach. As he approached, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. There was a sadness there, a silent pain that she couldn't express in words. They talked about banalities, the weather, work, but the tension between them was palpable. Something was about to happen, and they both knew it, even if they didn't yet have the courage to admit it. Emily's request to open the relationship didn't come suddenly. It was something she rehearsed for weeks, maybe months, pondering whether it was the right path to take. When I finally said the words, it was like letting go of a weight I had been carrying for a long time. Jonathan, however, was not prepared. The surprise on his face quickly gave way to confusion and pain. He couldn't understand why the woman he loved was proposing something so strange, so contrary to the life they had built together. His negative response was immediate, almost instinctive. For him, love was something exclusive, non-negotiable. And the thought of sharing her with someone else was unbearable. Emily, for her part, accepted the refusal with frightening calm. There were no arguments, no tears, just a nod and a deep sigh. Over the next few days, she began to withdraw even more. There was a stillness about her that Jonathan couldn't understand, a detachment that made him increasingly uncomfortable. He tried to get back to his routine, pretend that nothing had changed, but the truth was that everything was different. As the days passed, Jonathan began to notice small changes. Emily spent more time away from home, her messages became brief, and conversations became even rarer. The emptiness in the apartment grew, an echo of what they had lost. Jonathan felt something was coming, but he couldn't identify what it was. And deep down, I feared it was already too late to save what was left of the marriage. The reality is that while Jonathan was struggling to keep up appearances, Emily had already made her decision. She was ready to leave everything behind, and the request to open the relationship was just the first step in her planned exit. The question that hung in the air, unanswered, was when she would finally reveal her true intention, and what would be left of Jonathan when that happened. The days after Emily's proposal were filled with silent tension. Jonathan tried to convince himself that everything would go back to normal, that his wife's strange suggestion was just a temporary lapse, the result of a crisis that would soon pass. But normality never returned. What took its place was a growing emptiness, something Jonathan couldn't fill no matter how hard he tried. Emily now seemed to live in a world of her own, far from Jonathan and the memories that once united them. She went out more and more, with vague excuses about meeting friends or work commitments. Jonathan wanted to ask, to confront her, but something was stopping him. It was the fear of hearing an answer that I wasn't prepared to face. He knew, on some level, that the connection between them was dissolving, but still, he clung to the hope that if he waited long enough, things would work themselves out. One morning, while drinking his coffee alone at the kitchen table, Jonathan realized something was terribly wrong. It was Emily's absence, the disturbing silence that took over the house, once so full of life. It wasn't just the physical absence, but something deeper. She had withdrawn from him emotionally, and he didn't know how to reverse that. He decided he could no longer ignore what was happening. I needed answers. That night, Jonathan waited for Emily to return. When she finally walked through the door, the conversation he had been rehearsing in his mind all day began to take shape. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice filled with an urgency he couldn't hide. She stopped in the middle of the room, her gaze blank, unsurprised. "Of course," he replied, as if he had already expected it. Jonathan tried to remain calm, but his voice was shaking as he asked what was really going on. Emily, in turn, just shrugged, as if the conversation was inevitable but uninteresting. "You know things aren't the same anymore," she said, almost like a no-brainer. Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest. She didn't deny it, but she didn't explain it either. It was as if he was giving up on them, little by little, without even fighting. In the days that followed, Jonathan tried everything to win back the woman he still loved. He organized romantic dinners, weekend trips, and even bought flowers, something he hadn't done in years. But each attempt was met with indifference. Emily participated in everything, but her mind always seemed to be somewhere else, far away, far from him. Jonathan wondered where he had gone wrong, what else he could do to bring Emily back into the relationship they had once shared. While Jonathan was sinking into desperate attempts to rescue his marriage, Emily was increasingly distant. She no longer hid her detachment. The suitcases that were once quickly unpacked after trips now sat forgotten in the corner of the room for days, as if she no longer cared about the home they had created. Jonathan noticed these subtle changes, but instead of confronting her, he convinced himself that if he gave her enough space, she would find her way back to him. But Emily wasn't interested in going back. She had already made her decision, and her every gesture was a silent preparation for her imminent departure. For her, marriage was no longer a safe haven, but rather an anchor, and she was ready to break free. Emily's plan was clear: she would leave without major confrontation, leaving Jonathan with as little heartache as possible. But Jonathan, in his naivety and desperation, didn't see that. One night, Jonathan arrived home earlier than usual, decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time: surprise Emily with dinner. When he entered the house, however, he was greeted by a heavy silence. He didn't expect this. In the kitchen, he found a note left on the table, in Emily's handwriting. Jonathan's heart raced as he took the paper with shaking hands. The note was short, direct, but filled with a coldness that paralyzed him. "I went to spend the night at a friend's house. Don't wait up for me." Jonathan sat down in the nearest chair, the paper still in his hand, as a feeling of despair spread through his body. He tried calling her, but the calls went directly to voicemail. The anguish turned into physical pain, an emptiness in the chest that seemed to grow every minute. Jonathan was beginning to understand that something much worse than he imagined was happening. The idea that Emily might be planning to leave him began to solidify in his mind. He tried to shake the thought away, but he couldn't. Emily was escaping, and he was losing the person he loved most, without knowing how to stop it. In the following days, Jonathan began to investigate Emily's comings and goings more closely. He began to notice patterns, schedules, details that he had previously ignored. Emily was leaving earlier and returning later and later. She avoided long conversations, answered vaguely, as if she were hiding something. Jonathan felt panic rising, but decided he needed to wait. If he confronted her without proof, he ran the risk of pushing her further away. He needed to know the truth, and the truth, he felt, was close to being revealed. While Emily continued her evasive routine, Jonathan began to follow in her footsteps, trying to find out what she was doing, who she was meeting. Each discovery led him deeper into an abyss of uncertainty. He found messages on her phone, conversations without great details, but which indicated that something was happening. Jonathan knew he was on the verge of discovering something that would change everything. But what he didn't know was how devastating this discovery would be, not just for his marriage, but for the very notion he had of himself and the love he once believed to be unshakable. Emily's plan was unfolding before Jonathan's eyes, but he didn't have all the pieces yet. And the more he tried to put them together, the more disconnected from reality he felt. Fear, anguish and jealousy began to dominate his thoughts. He needed answers, but most of all, he needed courage to face what was coming. And while Jonathan waited for the right moment to act, the climax of this story approached, bringing with it truths he never imagined he would have to face. Jonathan was sitting in the living room, darkness enveloped the room as he held his cell phone in his hand, staring at the lit screen, where Emily's name was flashing. He knew that if he pressed the button the call would go through, but he was no longer sure he wanted to hear her voice. The last few days had been a whirlwind of emotions and suspicions, and increasingly, he felt like he was getting closer to a revelation that would change his life forever. That morning, Jonathan had made a decision. I was tired of waiting, tired of ignoring the signs. He needed answers, and he knew he wouldn't find them by continuing to pretend everything was fine. So he did something he never imagined doing, he hired a private investigator. It was a decision he made reluctantly, but one he felt was necessary. And now, just a day later, the investigator had gotten back to him with information. Jonathan hadn't read the full report yet, but he knew he needed to be prepared for what he would discover. When he finally opened the file on the computer, the photos were the first thing that appeared on the screen. Emily, smiling, but not at him. She was with a man, someone Jonathan had never seen before. The images showed the two of them in different parts of the city, always close, always smiling, as if they shared a secret that he didn't know. Jonathan's stomach turned, and anger, mixed with despair, began to bubble inside him. He continued to read the report, each word a blow. The investigator described frequent meetings, exchanged messages, conversations that indicated a much deeper relationship than Jonathan imagined. The evidence was overwhelming, but there was something more, something that wasn't in the photos or in the reports. Jonathan realized that Emily wasn't just cheating on him, she was moving away from him in a planned, calculated way. She had already begun to take apart the life they had together, piece by piece, preparing for the moment when she could leave the scene without leaving a trace. The opening of the relationship, he understood now, was a last attempt to soften the blow, to ensure that he wouldn't react badly when she finally left him. That night, Jonathan decided he needed a confrontation. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine, no longer wait for her to make the first move. He needed to know from Emily what was really happening, to hear from her what the report had already made clear. When Emily got home, he was waiting for her. Sitting in the armchair, with his back to the door, he heard her footsteps echo through the house, each one bringing with it a wave of tension. Jonathan? Emily's voice sounded in the hallway. She noticed the light on in the living room and went towards it, not knowing that this would be the moment when all masks would fall. When she entered the room, Jonathan didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her, letting the silence speak for itself. Emily felt the weight of that look and stopped, hesitating, as if she sensed what was coming. We need to talk, Jonathan finally said, his voice firm but filled with a sadness he couldn't hide. Emily took a deep breath, as if she was preparing herself for a battle she knew she couldn't win. She sat on the couch opposite him, folding her hands in her lap, waiting for him to begin. I know about the other man, Emily, Jonathan said bluntly, leaving no room for evasions. He watched the impact of the words on her face. Her eyes widened for a brief moment before she managed to hide her surprise. But it was already too late. Jonathan saw the panic on her face, the instant of vulnerability she couldn't hide. "Who is he?" Jonathan insisted, his voice now tinged with urgency. "And why didn't you have the decency to be honest with me?" Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was torn between the desire to defend herself and the need to tell the truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Jonathan, it's not what you think. Don't treat me like an idiot, Emily." Jonathan interrupted her, his anger exploding in a way he could no longer control. "I've seen the photos, I've read the reports. There's no hiding it anymore. You were planning on leaving me all along, weren't you? The request to open the relationship was just an excuse, a way to soften the blow, to make it seem like it was my fault for not accepting. Am I right?" Emily felt the tears welling up, but fought to keep them contained. She knew the truth was painful, but there was no running away from it anymore. "Yes," she admitted, the word coming out like poison. "I wanted to leave. I didn't know how to say it, Jonathan. I was scared of hurting you, of how you would react. So, yes, I tried to make it easier, but it wasn't fair. I know that wasn't fair." Jonathan stood up, unable to sit still as he listened to those words. He began pacing back and forth, his mind spinning with the revelation. "Did you think this would be easier? Betraying the trust we've built over the years, did you think this would be any less painful for me?" "I was lost," Emily replied, now openly crying. "I didn't know what to do, Jonathan. I didn't know how to leave without destroying you. We've both changed so much over the years, and I felt so suffocated, so trapped. I tried to love you like before, but you gave up," Jonathan added, his voice full of bitterness. "You gave up on us, and you didn't even have the courage to tell me the truth." "I tried," Emily shouted, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. "I tried to find a way to tell you, to make you understand, but I couldn't. I got lost along the way. And now, I'm sorry, Jonathan, but there's nothing left to do. No, I can continue living a lie." Emily's words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jonathan felt his world fall apart. He realized that the marriage he had desperately tried to save had been dead for a long time, he just hadn't realized it. And now, all that was left was the wreckage of a life he thought he had under control. Jonathan stopped walking and looked at Emily, his mind finally accepting what his heart already knew. "Did you really think lying would be the best solution?" he asked, his voice now tired, exhausted from all the pain. "Did I deserve this, Emily? After everything we've been through, everything we've built?" Emily lowered her head, without response. She knew she had destroyed what was left between them, but she also knew she could no longer go back. What was done was done. Now all that was left was to deal with the consequences of his choices. Jonathan felt the weight of the moment, and despite all the anger, sadness, and betrayal, he knew he needed closure for what had once been the center of his life. They were silent, both aware that this was the point of no return. The marriage was officially destroyed, but there was still something that Jonathan needed to know, something that he was about to discover, and that would change the way he would see the whole situation. In the second part of the climax, the final pieces would fall into place, and Jonathan would finally understand what had really motivated Emily, revealing a secret even more devastating than he could have imagined. The silence that followed that revelation was heavy and dense, like a fog that refuses to dissipate. Jonathan, still standing, was looking at Emily as if he were seeing her for the first time. He had imagined so many possible answers, but hearing from her that it was all just a poorly constructed lie left him floored. He tried to process what she had said, but his heart was beating fast, confusing his thoughts. Emily, sensing Jonathan's distress, tried to speak once more, her voice a little firmer now, as if she wanted to explain the unexplainable. "Jonathan, I really wanted it to work. I swear I tried, but the truth is that I fell in love with someone else. It wasn't something planned, it happened, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I tried to stay here, I tried to deal with it. That what we had was enough, but it wasn't. I was trapped in a life that no longer belonged to me. Jonathan felt the weight of each word, like knives digging into his chest. And you thought the solution was to open up the relationship? Did you think that was the way to tell me you were in love with another man? The disbelief in his voice was evident. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to explain without destroying you, Emily whispered, tears once again streaking her face. I was trying to protect you, but deep down, I was just delaying the inevitable. Jonathan laughed, but it was a bitter, humorless laugh. Protect me? Is that what you call protection? Deceive me, betray me, and then try to camouflage your escape as a viable alternative to our marriage? Emily didn't respond right away. She knew that nothing she said would make Jonathan fully understand what had been going through her mind. But then, something unexpected happened. Emily took a deep breath, wiped her tears with the back of her hands and looked directly at Jonathan, with a determination he hadn't expected. Jonathan, there's something else you need to know, she began, her voice low but filled with a seriousness that made him shudder. I didn't mean to tell you, but since we're here, I think you deserve the full truth. She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding on the right words. The truth is, I had already planned to leave you before I even thought about opening up the relationship. That request was a last resort, an attempt to get you to get away from me before I left. I thought that if you accepted, I could leave without looking like the villain of the story. Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. So, all this time, you were already planning to leave? And I was just an obstacle in your way? It wasn't like that, Emily replied quickly, trying desperately to make him understand. I was confused, lost. The man I'm with now, he made me feel alive again, like I hadn't felt in years. But I didn't know how to let go of you, how to let go of everything we'd built. I'm not a bad person, Jonathan, I lost myself. Jonathan felt a cold anger wash over him. You lost yourself? And why should that matter to me now? You didn't think about me, about us, when you decided to live this other life, did you? Emily swallowed. You're right, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I didn't think. I was selfish, I was weak. And now, all I can do is ask for forgiveness, even though I know it won't change anything. Jonathan sat on the couch, exhausted, feeling the weight of everything he had just heard. The plea for forgiveness felt hollow, an attempt to alleviate Emily's own guilt. He looked at her, trying to find the woman he once loved, but all he saw now was a stranger, someone who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Forgiveness, he muttered, more to himself than to her. As if it's possible to forgive that. Emily didn't respond, and the silence between them stretched, more charged than ever. Time seemed to have stopped, and the tension in the room was almost palpable. Finally, Jonathan stood up, the decision clear in his mind. I'm leaving, he said calmly, without anger, without sadness. Just acceptance. There's nothing left for us here. You've already made your choices, and now I need to make mine. Emily stood still, knowing there was nothing more to say. Jonathan looked at her one last time, trying to engrave in his memory the woman who once meant everything to him. But what he saw now was just a distorted reflection of who she used to be. Without another word, he turned and walked towards the door. And it was there, at that moment, that Jonathan realized that the end was not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of something new, something that he still couldn't fully understand, but that he knew was inevitable. The final revelation was made, but the scars it would leave were yet to form. When Jonathan left the house that night, the cold Chicago air enveloped him, providing a jolt that brought him back to reality. He walked aimlessly through the streets, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that were plaguing him. The anger, sadness and sense of betrayal were still intense, but there was something more, something that silently tormented him, emptiness. Jonathan had always prided himself on being a strong, rational man, but now, rationality seemed a fragile illusion. Everything he knew, everything he was, had been destroyed in a matter of minutes. He wandered the streets, lost in thought, until he found himself sitting on a park bench, the same one where he and Emily used to walk in the early years of their marriage. The irony did not go unnoticed. That place, which previously represented the beginning of something beautiful, now symbolized the end. Jonathan looked around, seeing other people walk by, oblivious to the chaos unfolding inside him. In that moment, he realized that the pain of betrayal was not just the result of Emily's lies, but also of what she had stolen from him, his trust, his security, and most of all, his hope in love. As he sat there, a question began to form in his mind, a question he had avoided until now: what would he do next? Jonathan knew he had two options. He could let bitterness consume him, turn him into someone cynical and closed off from the world. Or he could try to find a new path, something that gave meaning to what was left of his life. But the second option seemed impossible. How could he move on when everything he knew had been destroyed? The life he and Emily had built together was the foundation of his identity, and now that that foundation had been removed, Jonathan didn't know who he was. More than the betrayal, it was this loss of identity that scared him. He always defined himself as a devoted husband, a man of principles who valued his family above all else. But now, without that role to play, he felt adrift. It was at this moment that a moral dilemma began to emerge. Jonathan knew he had the power to expose Emily, to destroy her image in the eyes of her friends and community. He had the evidence, the messages, the photos. He could make her pay for what she had done, make sure she felt the pain he was feeling. It was tempting. The idea of revenge presented itself as a temporary balm for the open wound in his heart. But at the same time, there was another voice in his mind, calmer and more rational. This voice told him that revenge would not bring the peace he sought. Hurting Emily the way she hurt him might provide momentary satisfaction, but it wouldn't heal the emptiness inside him. Jonathan wondered if, by giving in to revenge, he was just perpetuating the cycle of pain, becoming exactly the kind of person he despised. He realized that the real battle was not against Emily, but against himself. Sitting on that bench, Jonathan found himself faced with a complex moral dilemma: take revenge on Emily and destroy what little was left of her integrity, or find a way to move forward without allowing hatred to consume him. The choice was difficult as both options came with a cost. He could live with the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but at the price of his own humanity. Or he could try to forgive, not for Emily, but for himself, in hopes of finding some kind of redemption. The dilemma gnawed at Jonathan inside as he tried to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He knew that regardless of his choice, the impact would be profound and lasting. If he chose revenge, he knew he would never be the same, that he would transform into someone even he wouldn't recognize. But if he chose forgiveness, he would have to face the challenge of rebuilding his life on the rubble of what he had lost. As he weighed his options, Jonathan realized that in order to make a decision, he would need to find clarity, something that would allow him to see beyond the pain and anger. And as he got up from the bench and started walking back home, he knew the next step would be crucial. He would need to decide whether to follow the path of destruction or reconstruction. The choice, he knew, would define not only Emily's future, but his own. Jonathan knew he needed to make a decision, and the dilemma that had accompanied him since Emily's revelation consumed him every moment. He spent days in a state of deep contemplation, trying to find a way out of the anguish he felt. He knew his life wouldn't be the same no matter what path he chose, but he was determined not to let betrayal define him. There was a part of him that still wanted revenge, that wanted to see Emily suffer as he had suffered, but at the same time, he knew that the desire for revenge could take him to an even darker place than where he was now. It was then that Jonathan made the decision that would change everything. Rather than destroy Emily, he decided to follow a different path, a path that he knew would require more strength and courage than anything he had ever faced. Jonathan decided that the best revenge would be his own reconstruction, not to prove anything to Emily, but to himself. He committed himself to getting back on his feet, to rediscovering who he was outside of the marriage that had fallen apart. And to do that, he would need to start letting go of the weight of the past. Jonathan found a lawyer and began the divorce process. He didn't want to drag the situation out any longer than necessary. Emily, surprised by Jonathan's serenity, accepted the proposed terms without resistance. Perhaps he expected a more explosive, more dramatic reaction, but all he received was a devastating calm. The delivery of the divorce papers was quick and efficient, without unnecessary emotions, without additional words. It was the end of an era, signed with pen and silence. Emily, in turn, was taken by surprise by Jonathan's attitude. She expected hatred, expected to be confronted, but what she found was resolute coldness. And that left her disconcerted. Deep down, she knew she deserved worse, and the absence of direct punishment, of retaliation that she had prepared herself to face, left her adrift. There was no redemption, but there was also no punishment she expected. The emptiness that washed over her was as deep as what Jonathan had experienced. The months that followed were transformative. Jonathan dove into a new architectural project, something he had put off for years. Construction, both physical and emotional, became his new mission. He began to rediscover life on his own, to rebuild not just his career but his identity. The process was painful, yes, but it was also liberating. Jonathan realized there was a strength within himself that he had never tapped, a resilience that allowed him to move forward without looking back. Emily, on the other hand, faced the consequences of her choices in a way she didn't expect. Her relationship with the other man, who she believed was her future, quickly fell apart when he realized she was carrying a guilt she would never be able to overcome. Emily tried to move on, but the choices she made left her scarred, and she soon found herself alone, dealing with the reality that there was no going back. Emily's destiny was marked by loneliness. She moved away from her old social circles, trying to find a new beginning, but the weight of past decisions followed her. Memories of Jonathan, not as the husband she left but as the man she betrayed, became a constant shadow in her life. Without Jonathan's support, without the man she had rejected in pursuit of something that could never satisfy her, Emily found herself living a life of silent regret, where each day was a reminder of what she had destroyed. Jonathan, on the other hand, found a new purpose. He didn't forgive Emily, but he decided not to let hate eat away at what was left of his life. And so, he moved on, stronger, wiser, and finally at peace. The impact of the betrayal was not forgotten, but Jonathan had found a way to turn the pain into growth. He became a renewed man, a man who no longer lived in the shadow of his wounds, but who used them as the basis for his new life. Fate separated them, but the lessons remain. Jonathan continued to live, not as the betrayed man, but as someone who, despite everything, rebuilt himself from the ashes. And Emily, on the contrary, was trapped in the consequences of her choices, condemned to live with the knowledge that she was the cause of her own ruin. The end of a marriage, but the beginning of a new story, where the scars of the past became the foundation for an unexpected and, in some ways, stronger future.